Hello, my name is Tony Mansueto. Welcome to Seeking Wisdom and our series entitled Power and the Common Good, which will help you understand the theory and practice of organizing in political strategy, how to build and exercise power in service to the common good. This session will focus on power as relational practice. We will explore the nature of power, show that power is not something we have, but something that we exercise in connection and relationship with others. And we will talk a little bit as well about some related concepts such as authority, imperium or command, and specifically the distinction between power, control, and coercion. Before we begin, I would like to invite you to learn a little bit more about Seeking Wisdom. You can visit our webpage below, and if you're interested in supporting us, please visit our Patreon page. We look forward to developing a longer-term relationship with you. And thank you so much. And now, the nature of power, authority, and command. The word power comes from the Latin potere, or in the substantive potestas, and you can see its derivatives as well in the various Romance languages as pouvoir, poder, potere. As a verb, it fundamentally means to be able to. It is the ability to get things done. And it is in the nature of power to belong to the people. Even in a society which has declined into authoritarianism, even in a society in which people have been rendered passive, the ultimate power belongs to them because they are the ones who are, for whatever reason, being mystified or terrified or alienated into passivity. So we're going to see that this means that the people are the fundamental political actors in any system and in any situation. And I'm also going to put forward a proposition here and suggest to you that building and exercising power requires very little. It requires two people, a purpose, and a plan. Now, authority is something distinct from power. The word authority comes from the Latin auctoritas, which is the ability to author or augment something. And historically, it has been used to describe the legitimate exercise of power. So, for example, in ancient Rome, from which most certainly European concepts of authority derive, the laws were made by the people, but they were validated, or their legitimacy was validated by the Senate, which is why we say that laws are made senatus populusque. Now, the concept of authority can be used both normatively and analytically. And if we're using it normatively, we're saying that a particular exercise of power was actually legitimate in an ethical or moral sense. And we will argue that in order to be legitimate in the long run, a particular exercise of power needs to actually serve the common good and thus be in accord with natural law. We can also use the term analytically, in which we are saying that the people in a particular society regard the authority as legitimate, or rather regard the exercise of power as legitimate. And this is something that Max Weber devoted himself to rather extensively, distinguishing between traditional authority, which was based on long-standing practice, or charismatic authority based on personal characteristics, a kind of institutionalized charisma in which the charisma of the founder of a dynasty becomes embodied in his lineage, or the founder of a religion becomes embedded in a particular institution like the church. Um, there's also a kind of rational legal authority or bureaucratic authority, which is common in our society, in which legitimacy adheres in the process, so that laws that are made in the proper way are regarded as legitimate regardless of their content. And then finally, there's sort of what for Weber was an empty set, but which we will argue is the most important type of authority, and that's substantively rational authority, or authority which is based on the argument, the quality of the argument. And we see that most fully in the context of rabbinic Judaism, where there really is no authority beyond the best argument. There's no pope, there's no centralized structure, there's no central authority to make decisions, although we do see echoes of that in other religious and philosophical traditions as well. And so, because of this, we say that authority belongs to the elders, in the sense that it belongs to those who are most fundamentally versed in understanding, again, depending on your particular conception of authority, the traditions of the people, the process that's required, or substantive arguments. And authority fundamentally, we will argue, requires wisdom, both pure wisdom, theoretical wisdom, the ability to understand the nature of the common good, and also practical wisdom or prudence, and the ability to apply those principles correctly in a particular context. Now, imperium is an interesting animal in its own right. Imperium is, again, a substantive of the Latin imperare, to command. We see echoes of that in the word imperative in English. And this is often what people actually mean by power. And it is kind of a combination of authority and power. And it is, in effect, the right and ability to issue orders, to issue commands of the sort that we see exemplified most purely in a military context, but which we also see in the authority of executive magistrates, for example, a president or a governor, or in a much more limited way, a mayor. This requires both power and authority. It requires power because if you don't have any power, no one's going to listen to you. And it requires authority because if you don't have any authority, no one is going to listen to you, or they are going to challenge the both your command and the obedience of those who listen to you as illegitimate. And this is a very specialized type of phenomenon that historically, again in the Roman context where a lot of these concepts come from, belongs only to certain magistrates. It would belong to commanders in an army, it would belong to the republic, to the consuls, and certain other magistrates who had that ability to command, who had the right to command, the authority, but also the popular and political support to make their commands effective. Now, I'd like to make a sharp distinction here between power on the one hand and two other ideas that are often associated with it. The idea of control and the idea of coercion, or what we sometimes call linear power. If power is the ability to get things done, then control is the ability to keep things from happening. So imagine that I come into a room full of people with an automatic weapon. Okay? If I tell them not to leave, they probably won't leave. If I tell them not to talk, they probably won't talk. I have a very significant degree of control. Okay? If I tell them all to get out, they will probably get out. So I have a little bit of power. But I probably don't have the power to ask them to um, paint a fresco or compose a piece of music or even to write down in an honest and interesting and complex way what they're experiencing because I've scared the living you know what's out of them. Okay? And that's not going to happen. They're not going to be able to do anything complex. So control is not necessarily always a bad thing. There are times when we have to exercise control because we have to keep really bad things from happening. But it is not the same thing as power. In a way, it is the reverse of power, or it is a check on power. Coercion is the ability to force things to happen against the interest and will of those involved. Okay? And again, there may well be contexts where this is necessary, but it is going to be very, very, very limited. We are only going to be able to accomplish some very, very limited things in this way. When I'm thinking in terms of um, linear power or coercion, I'm basically asking, what do I want? What am I trying to accomplish? And who or what is in the way? And we are basically pushing uh, those obstacles away, either by exercising control of the situation and ultimately terrorizing people into not acting on their own beliefs or their own interests, or we are forcing them to act in the way we want them to. Okay? And this is a very, very, very brittle uh, uh, and costly way of exercising power. What we're going to be advocating here is relational power. And here we approach the situation in a very different way. When we're thinking in a relational manner, we ask, what are my interests? And notice that it's in the plural because we may have some particular things on our mind that we'd like to accomplish um, in the more or less immediate future. But we are creatures that live for a modestly extended period, and we have many different interests and many different things we want to accomplish. And the first step in exercising relational power is understanding the range of our own interests. And again, as we've stressed in other contexts, by interests here, we don't just mean narrow material interests. We don't mean acting in a kind of egoistic way. Our interests are the things that we are connected with. The second question we ask is who else is involved? Okay? Who else has an impact on what is going to happen in a particular situation? And what are their interests? Okay? What are they trying to accomplish? And then we go and we begin looking for overlaps, areas where we can collaborate, so that we can both realize our interests and build power. And we're trying to do that in a way which also realizes the interests of other people because that's going to establish a continuing, ongoing relationship which will allow us to accomplish things together in the future. Now, broadly speaking, on a larger scale, we can think of power in three different ways. Power consists in organized money, organized people, and organized mana. So organized money is basically what we call capital, financial capital in particular. And if you have that capital, you can hire people who don't have capital, but who have the skills you need in order to do what you want done. Okay? And this is obviously the dominant form in which power is built and exercised in our society, and not always in service of the common good. In part because it depends on the vast majority of people being forced to sell their labor power and thus to be in a position where they can essentially be coerced. It may be a softer kind of coercion than standing there with a machine gun, but hunger can be a powerful motivator. Care for our families can be a powerful motivator. And what is essentially happening here is that by and large, our interests, the interests of the vast majority, our principles, our values, what we aspire to, is being cast aside, is being repressed, so that the people who have the capital can get done what they want to get done. Organized people is sometimes called social capital. We like to say direct social capital because it means really networks of people who either share your interests or care about you personally, who you can get to do things either for you because they care about you or together with you because you share interests. Okay? And this is really the kind of power that the organizing process that we're teaching is primarily focused on building. And then there's a third kind of power, which is organized manna. And this isn't manna like in the biblical sense of manna from heaven. This is manna in the sense that ethnographers and anthropologists have expropriated from certain Polynesian cultures, where it refers to a kind of power that inheres in a person or in an object because it's holy or sacred. Okay? And this is the power that people have based on their authority, based on the fact that they are either actually consistently acting and acting effectively in service of the common good, or people believe that they are. Okay? In general, if people respect you because they believe that you embody the values they share, they will sometimes do what you ask. And we will also be talking to a significant extent about building that kind of organized manna, because often it is the organized manna that allows you to gain access to the networks of people that you need to in order to actually organize. Okay? A very good example of that is looking, say, at the history of the civil rights movement. Dr. King started out primarily with organized manna. He had a certain amount of authority because he was a preacher. He wasn't a very effective preacher. And he was able to win the respect of other preachers, other clergy, and through that he was able to gain access to their congregations or to motivate them to access their own congregations. And that's where the numbers came from. That's where the organized people came from. Now, his tactics also were designed to leverage that kind of organized manna, because the whole rationale behind nonviolent direct action was centered on people being willing to put certainly their well-being, if not their lives, on the line. And again, the idea being that that would garner respect. Turns out there's some serious questions and problems with that, but we will look at that in a later session. And I'm including here again the slide from our first session where we looked at the amount of capital which would be necessary in order to run an organization without having to worry about providing profits and dividends to investors, without having to worry about paying interest to a bank, or without having to meet market demand. In other words, an organization which could securely act on behalf of its own understanding of the common good. And as we said before, it's very, very, very substantial. in order to have an organization that's reliably supported 100 people, you would need to have a budget of about $10 million annually, and that would require an endowment of $250 million. So that's on the level of the Bushes and the Kennedys. Not the wealthiest people in the world, but certainly extraordinarily wealthy. And so, what is the alternative? As we suggested, the alternative to having that kind of capital or spending generations trying to accumulate that kind of capital, and in the process perhaps doing all kinds of harm, the alternative is to use organized manna, to use people's respect for us and for those we can engage who are regarded as leaders to access their networks and then go through this organizing process, which will allow us to tap into the interests of people, allow us to tap into the networks of people, and to train them to act effectively in the public arena in service to the common good. And we will see how that works in some upcoming sessions. Before we begin, I would like to invite you to learn a little bit more about Seeking Wisdom. You can visit our webpage below, and if you're interested in supporting us, please visit our Patreon page. We look forward to developing a longer term relationship with you. And thank you so much.